Hello and welcome to The Edge, where we'll take an in-depth analysis of today's top stories by looking beyond the edge. We're bringing not just the facts but also deep insights into the topics with expert opinions and social media reactions. So let's make a start with our look beyond the edge. Israeli forces detained the relatives of 6 Palestinian prisoners who escaped from a high-security prison in northern Israel. Hundreds of Palestinians have been injured during clashes with Israeli forces. Protests come as Israel has brought reinforcements into the occupied West Bank and launched house-to-house searches in several towns. Will the Israeli aggression further intensify in the coming days? Ethiopia says that rebellious forces from the Tigray region have been defeated in the adjacent Afar region and have withdrawn. The Tigrayan forces said that they had merely shifted troops to neighbouring AMHARA for an offensive there. Thousands of people have been killed and more than 2 million have been forced to flee their homes since the war broke out in Tigray. What is the international community doing to stop the humanitarian crisis in the region? And anti-Muslim sentiments certainly existed long before 9/11 attacks, and response to them intensified anti-Muslim tropes. Canada is the latest example of the discrimination due to religion and skin colour. But what is the real reason behind rising Islamophobia? And is the Western media doing enough to prevent Islamophobic sentiment? These are the top 3 stories that we'll be taking a look at today from Beyond the Edge. Let's get started. Since the 1970s, discussions have been held to find a solution to the never-ending Palestinian-Israeli tensions. What proposals have been put forward? Our following infographic explains. Israel's atrocities against Palestinians are continuing to rise, with new attacks taking place in the West Bank.
Dozens of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank have been wounded in confrontations with Israeli soldiers while protesting in solidarity with 6 Palestinian men who managed to escape a high-security prison earlier this week. Relatives of Palestinian prisoners have been arrested as Israel launched a massive manhunt to capture the 6 men who tunneled out of Gilboa jail on Monday. Israeli forces fired tear gas, rubber-coated bullets and live ammunition at crowds who were taking part in rallies on Wednesday evening across various cities in the West Bank, wounding hundreds. Hundreds demonstrated in support of the 6 escapees and Palestinian detainees who have been subjected to punitive measures in Israeli prison facilities after the escape.
I'm now joined live from New York by IBRAHIM, who's a licensed attorney in the state of New York and executive director for Law of Palestine organization. Hiba, thank you so much for joining us here today on The Edge.
Thank you.
Before we start, could you just very briefly explain to us the situation about the 6 men who escaped from a prison and what's doubly controversial about the location of the prison and so on and so forth?
Yeah. First of all, allow me to thank you for having me today to speak on this urgent matter on the Palestinian scene, a matter that I claim the whole international community is following closely. When we address the issue of prison break and the legality of the prison break under international law, we need to differentiate between two times of peace and times of war. While the national laws of different countries around the world criminalize prison break and considers it a punishable offense, international humanitarian law that governs the state of war and occupation has a different point of view. To begin with, we need to differentiate between two legal statuses of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons. We have prisoners of war, which might include members of armed forces and Palestinian armed militias and groups. And then we have Palestinian prisoners who are civilians and are detained in Israeli prisons. For the 6 Palestinian prisoners who succeeded in escaping Israeli prisons are probably civilians protected under the 4th Geneva Convention. But let's say if some of them are considered to be prisoners of war who were previously members of Palestinian armed groups, then we have Article 28 of the Brussels Declaration of the 1874, which is considered the draft international declaration of war customs and laws. Under this convention and under Article 28 of this convention, a successful escape shall only be punishable by a disciplinary punishment. While Article 8 of the 1907 Hague Convention, which has a universal consensus and is actually part of the international customary law, the Israeli authorities are not permitted to use weapons against prisoners who succeeded to escape. Now, when we speak about prisoners of war, we have to address the 3rd Geneva Convention of 1949. This convention has been ratified by both Israel and the US among 190 countries who ratified the convention. In its articles 91 to 94, the Geneva Convention states that a successful escape shall not be liable for any punishment, neither a criminal punishment nor a disciplinary punishment. And about the contradiction that you just mentioned, there is a very interesting idea that the International Committee of Red Cross, the ICRC, addressed in its commentary 1960, which was later updated with its commentary 2020 of the 3rd Geneva Convention, in which the ICRC addressed the idea of paradox of escape. The paradox of escape means that attempting to escape the enemy's prison falls within two contradicting dilemmas. On the one hand, it's prohibited and actually punishable under the laws of the arresting state, the enemy state. But on the other hand, it's a right, a duty, actually, a moral or sometimes a legal duty to attempt to escape the prison under the laws of the state of the prisoner himself. That's why the ICRC considered the attempt to escape a prison not in violation of international law. Rather, it's a right that is derived indirectly from the privilege of combat. This, if we were to consider some of the prisoners who escaped the prison to be prisoners of war. On the other hand, we have prisoners who are merely civilians. Most of the Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons are civilians and thus protected under the the 4th Geneva Convention of 1949. This convention in its Article 120 states that an attempt to escape or even a successful escape, if the prisoner is recaptured later, then he's only entitled to a disciplinary punishment, not a criminal punishment. And he does not lose any of his safeguards or protections granted to him under the Fourth Geneva Convention. So just to summarize here, if these prisoners were to be considered prisoners of war, then they're not liable to any type of punishment, neither criminal nor disciplinary. And if they were to be considered civilians, and that's the most probable here option here, is then they are not liable to a criminal punishment. Rather, they're liable only to a disciplinary punishment.
So this really brings into question the type of activities that Israeli forces are meting out, or have been meting out over the last few days, arresting other family members and threatening with arms. This seems totally contrary to what you've just been describing to us, and makes it understandable that, for example, the Palestinians in the Jenin camp have said that they will stand up forcibly, if necessary, against any incursion by Israeli forces there. And the Jenin camp itself has a history of needing to defend itself. What can you tell us about the situation there?
Okay, so generally speaking here, Palestinians have the right to resist their occupier. This right is derived from their other international basic rights to liberation, freedom, independence. We're talking about self-determination. All these rights were granted to peoples under occupation in the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 3314 of the 1974. In this resolution, the United Nations General Assembly prohibited states from military occupation. And in times of occupation, it granted occupied people who find themselves under any form of foreign domination to struggle and to resist their occupier and to seek and to receive support. Now, in this resolution, the General Assembly did not specify what means does the Palestinian people or any other people who find themselves under military occupation have to resist their occupier. But later, in its resolution 3743 of 1982, the United Nations General Assembly explicitly upheld the right of the occupied people to resist their occupier and struggle with their occupier with any and all lawful means, including armed resistance. So since 1967, the international community has designated both the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza Strip, to be under military occupation. What does that mean? It means that not only Israel lacks the base to attack Palestinians, but it also has a duty under international law to provide a normal life under what is known as the maintain of law and order duty. Under this duty, Israel is obligated to protect Palestinian lives, to protect their properties rather than attack them. Now, in case Israel decided to conduct a military operation, whether in Jenin camp or other Palestinian cities, in reaction to the prison break of the 6 Palestinian prisoners, then this would amount to collective punishment of Palestinians. Collective punishment is prohibited under Hague Convention. It's prohibited under the 3rd and the 4th Geneva Conventions and under the Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions. This would also amount to war crimes prohibited under Article 8 of the Rome Statute of the ICC, and it potentially amounts to a crime of aggression, let alone talking about...
So what about the responsibilities of the international community to enforce all of this?
Yeah, so not only the international community has a responsibility here, we have collective responsibilities on different levels. So, for example, the Israeli civilian and military authorities are fully and directly responsible for compromising the lives of the 6 prisoners who escaped their prison. They are fully and directly responsible for any inhuman condition that they subject the rest of the Palestinian detainees and prisoners in their prisons too. Any inhuman conditions, any collective punitive measures. The Palestinian National Authority is actually has actually a duty to provide all means of protection for these 6 prisoners who flee the Israeli prisons. Then we have the international community a duty to provide all means and ensure the release of Palestinian prisoners and end their suffering. We have a responsibility on the prosecutor of the ICC to initiate an immediate investigation into the Israeli violations against Palestinian prisoners.
So we must call for all these duties to actually be put into force. Unfortunately, Hiba, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for explaining us in such helpful detail the situation there, and that it isn't maybe as simple as most people would see looking in from the outside. Thank you so much for joining us today on The Edge. Now, Israel has deployed drones, road checkpoints, and an army mission to Jenin, the flashpoint West Bank hometown of many of the men who were imprisoned while under international humanitarian law. Detainees from the occupied territory must be detained in the occupied territory. Coming days will show, however, if the situation in the region will further escalate. For now, let's move on to our next topic to speak about the crisis in an African country, namely Ethiopia. 10 months of conflict in Ethiopia between the country's defence force and the Tigray People's Liberation Front has left hundreds of thousands of people displaced and thousands more dead. But how did the conflict start? Let's find out from our infographic. Armed forces in Ethiopia's breakaway Tigray region have killed more than 120 civilians in recent days, following heavy battlefield losses.
Rebellious forces from the Tigray region killed 120 civilians over 2 days in a village in Ethiopia's AMHARA region, in what would be one of the deadliest massacres of the East African nation's 10-month war. That's according to officials from the AMHARA region. The killings in a village 10 kilometres from the town of Dabat took place on the 1st and 2nd of September. Tigrayan forces later issued a statement rejecting what they called a fabricated allegation by the AMHARA regional government, denying any involvement in the killing of civilians. It's the first such report of Tigrayan forces killing a large number of civilians since they seized territory in AMHARA. Tens of thousands of people fled their homes in the region as the Tigrayan forces advanced. Chalachu Dagnew, a spokesperson of nearby Gondar city, said he had visited the burial area in the village and that children, women and elderly were among the dead. Last month, Ethiopia's government urged citizens to join the fight against the Tigrayan forces.
And to discuss this, I'm joined live from Minneapolis in the United States by Ethiopian activist Edar Dawano. Edar, thank you for joining us again here today on The Edge. Now, this year we've had the occasion to talk several times about the situation in the north of Ethiopia. Can you bring us up to date the current situation from your perspective?
Thank you for having me. As far as the current situation in the northern part of Ethiopia, is that, as you know, since the Ethiopian government have declared Israel ceasefire, the government has stopped waging war. However, the TPLF force, ever since the war has stopped in the early few months, the Tigrayan force have gone towards south in the east, raiding the nearby regional state of Afar in the AMHARA regions. They have continued their aggression coming toward the AMHARA regional state and Afar, attacking and looting and whatnot. Even though the government was trying to situate the situation by stopping the war to allow human aid to be supplied, the TPLF have continued to engage in fight and aggression and occupying lands and pretty much taking control of towns and cities, and that has been going on. And over the last month now or so, the government is rethinking to be able to push back the TPLF to their regional states, and also hope that they will come to their own conscience to be able to sit down and dialogue and find a peaceful way of ending the war. However, for the TPLF, that is not a solution. They have proposed numerous positions in which they are willing to negotiate, however, which is very much unthinkable as far as the government's concerned. And so now what's happening is pretty much a push and shove taking place in the middle of this thing. Countless innocent lives has been lost. So this is what's taking place right now.
Now, over the past 10 months, there have been accusations of both sides of abuses, and war in any situation is tragic. But this particular conflict has been very disturbing, with accounts from both sides. Now, the TPLF are denying that the massacre that's recently described. How reliable are the reports?
TPLF have never admitted its mistakes and wrongdoings historically. It is a terroristic organization that continues to survive on lies and misinformation and propaganda. Therefore, whatever TPLF might say and sound is not reliable, it's not truthful, it is way off of the truth in the reality. And at this point, they know they're not going to win the war. They know they're not going to achieve what they aspired. However, it is up to them to continue to create more destructions and kill and terrorize the region, and then just pave a way that to show to the international community that the government is not managing, the government is not real government. So they will continue to engage in such a atrocity, in such criminal activities. TPLF is not different from ISIS or Al-Shabaab in the region. However, the difference between the two groups is when Al-Shabaab or ISIS committed a crime, it kind of own up to it. It calls it its own. It will accept the fact that it has done damage. It will own the conduct. TPLF never admit its wrongdoing, so always depict itself as a very much holistic institution or organization. However, to the Ethiopians, TPLF is nothing but a terrorist organization that needs to be denounced by international community, which have not been done so far. And for this reason, TPLF will continue to misinform the international community by propagating lies and coming up with agenda that would smear the government as if the government is not caring or reliable government that is running the country at this point. So to expect truth from TPLF, it is very much unthinkable. TPLF was born with lie. It would remain to survive for such time, continuing to propagate such lie, but it will not go far.
One of the problems in the first months of this conflict, in particular, when there were also forces from Eritrea and elsewhere involved in the conflict, was that the journalists from outside of Ethiopia weren't given access to the area to actually uncover the truths of what was happening there, or to verify that what one group was saying or whether what the government was saying was true or false or whatever. Has that situation changed, and is open access and maybe investigation going to be encouraged into what happened in the past and what is happening today?
When war happens, everything is much complicated. There's no such thing as a factual reasoning that's taking place. It is all about this claim, that claim, allegation after allegation. However, one thing that we know is that the government is a government that's trying to sustain its image and then present the fact as possible to the media and international community. However, for the TPLF, it is in their advantage to misinform the communities, misinform the international community as far as how things are going. And in fact, with this current recent massacre, they have went and denied the massacre they committed. But the government is also looking into, with the regional state authorities, with the regional government, to investigate more as far as the number of deaths that's been so far been witnessed. So there will be more further investigation that need to be done. But expecting things to be real from the TPLF, it is much unthinkable. However, it is that we expect that the government will come up with the truth, some sort of realistic numbers of atrocity being committed and expose the TPLF conduct.
As the TPLF rebels are advancing, thousands of people are being displaced from their homes. What can you tell us about the repercussions of that, how it's developing into a humanitarian crisis?
Yes, well, they are moving toward the south to create destruction, and people are scared. So people always run to survive. There is the issue of a food shortage. There is a humanitarian crisis taking place. Of course, nobody's willing to accept and wait for a crisis to come to their house. So they're fleeing, and the TPLF are the ones that's continuously engaged in aggression in the region. For this reason, people are moving. And now, the fact that the reason behind why the TPLF start to go attack civilians is because the federal government force right now are pushing them back. It's pushing them back to TIGRAY regional state. It is for this reason, since they cannot face and challenge the federal government's military, they'll end up killing innocent civilians. The saddest part is they're not only killing civilians, they're not only limiting themselves to human life, but they're also killing animals. They have gone to that level of creating a basic foundation destruction to the way of life for the people. We're talking about farmers. We're talking about children, mothers, elderlies. We're talking about a church priest. So they are there to terrorize, to create a fear deep down into the population. So as a result of this thing, people do migrate. People are moving around. So this is continuously taking place. But shortly, I think this thing will come to an end.
And in terms of supporting the people that are being displaced, what is the Ethiopian government being able to do? I seem to remember that medical centres had previously been destroyed, and of course with the pandemic ongoing in Ethiopia as everywhere else around the world, what is the government able to do to support those people?
In areas where there's no war or conflict taking place, the government is able to deliver foods, continues to do so because it is the responsibility of the government to make sure that civilians are saved and then receive the possible humanitarian aid. And furthermore, that international communities, international humanitarian aids are also being able to deliver food, not only within the Afar and the AMHARA regional state, but also in Mekelle, in all TIGRAY regional state. So this international humanitarian aids are being able to deliver humanitarian needs in goods and money and whatnot. So that is taking place, actually. There is much progress. However, the TPLF are claiming to have people die off of food shortage and hunger, while we see their media exposing that how Tigrayan civilians, mothers are preparing food and feeding the TPLF force to go on a war. So what they're claiming is that there's a food shortage. There's an issue of that. However, the truth is that humanitarian aids are being delivered to Tigray.
So is what is necessary, Eduard? It's very sad that this conflict started. I know the TPLF were ruling the area for about 30 years before, and the government wanted to change the status quo. If this had been done in a more diplomatic fashion rather than confrontational, the whole scenario would be different now. So is the government, as well as trying to bring about a ceasefire, is it trying to find a diplomatic solution, political solution?
Absolutely. As you recall, sometimes I think it was last month when the United Nations Security Council discussed the issue in Tigray, they all come down to underline this is an African issue that need to be solved by the Africans themselves. As a result, the AU have delegated a former Nigerian president to go between the two and come to a dialogue table. And however, the first step is that TPLF has been already declared a terrorist organization within the country in Ethiopia. Therefore, before any dialogue takes place, that stigma needs to be removed. And to do that, the Ethiopian government must set its new government in position. And if the people feel like, and if the parliamentary feel like it is good to remove the stigma of TPLF as a terrorist and then allow them to sit down and negotiate, so be it. However, meanwhile, while all is taking place, TPLF has not displayed any will to come to discussion. Mm-hmm. They are continuing their aggression. Therefore, they need to be able to come to their own conscience and have the will to negotiate. They don't have to wait for the Ethiopian government to remove that stigma of terrorism from the organization. If they truly care, they need to stop aggression. They need to come to their own thinking that maybe we need to stop and then we need to rethink and allow the AU delegates to make sure that this dialogue takes place and this conflict and all the chaos in the region will come to a peaceful resolution. Well, that must be a table, yeah.
For all in the region, everyone wants peace. They want to live in their homes. Let's hope that this is brought to a conclusion sooner rather than later. Eduardo, thank you so much for joining us again here today on The Edge. Thank you. In July, after the TPLF recaptured the regional capital of Mekelle and seized back most of Tigray, its forces advanced into Afar and Amhara regions, marking an expansion of the conflict into previously untouched areas. Since then, the government estimates that around 450,000 people have fled fighting in those two regions. Coming weeks will show if the international community intervenes to stop the escalation. And for now, let's move on to our final topic to speak about rising Islamophobia. Islamophobia is the rising problem of this century, with false assumptions fueling the crisis. Our following infographic has more. Canada's discrimination against Muslims is on the rise once again, but Canada's Revenue Agency will launch a probe against those being treated unfairly.
Canada's Revenue Agency will launch a probe after Muslim and other minority charities submitted a complaint about being unfairly targeted for audits. Taxpayers' ombudsperson Francois Boyot said that he will address the issues and concerns expressed by Muslim charities and other charities led by people of colour. The ombudsperson's office will ask the charities in question to share their experience and the agency's efforts to combat discrimination. Tim McSorley, the national coordinator of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, noted that the treatment of Muslim charities is common among other government institutions, but the Canada Revenue Agency's treatment especially has implications as it impacts how the agency audits these groups. Urging him to reform the Canada Revenue Agency's practices and overturn the agency's decision to suspend a well-established Muslim charity's ability to issue tax receipts.
And I'm now joined from Birmingham in the United Kingdom by Professor Francis Davis, who's a Professor of Religion and Public Policy at the University of Birmingham. Professor Davis, thank you so much for joining us here today on The Edge.
Good to see you.
Francis, the situation in Canada is particularly interesting because Canada is always billed as a very welcoming country, and yet we got a probe being opened into at the request of Muslim and other minority charities who has submitted a complaint about being unfairly targeted for audits. Is this sort of targeted behaviour common? Francis, can you help me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. So yeah, I think the Canadian situation is very interesting because Canada has always been the absolute pioneer of inclusive societies, both in terms of political philosophy and the design of their constitution. And here we have a situation with only 1 million Muslims out of a population of about 4 million, where Islamophobia or Islamic attacks are up by 9%, where there have been reports that 98% of prosecutions by the security services are of Muslims, and where in some regions there have been attempts to introduce new laws to stop Muslims being free to wear what they want to wear or to say what they want to do or so on and so forth. And so it seems to me we're going for a transition here, that there's a new minority arrived in Canada, and it's a minority that's visible, and it's a minority that's very concentrated, particularly in one of the provinces in Ontario, in the city of Toronto. And this is generating some new dynamics in Canadian society that the government is really struggling to make sense of and to respond to properly.
Now, given that, especially after the attack of 9/11, now 20 years ago, many Muslim Americans left America and moved to Canada. Is this one of the things that has changed the demographic, or has there always been a Muslim community of some nature in Canada?
Well, there will have been a community of some kind, but I think the thing that's changed things in recent years is not the new arrival of those Muslims across the border, although that's part of it. It's been the atmosphere generated by Donald Trump. You have to remember that 95% of Canadians live 150 miles or less from the American border. So we've had the atmosphere of Trump. And in 2017, we had an attack on the Quebec Muslim Center. But then we've had some bad attempts at legislation. So in 2019, there was a laïcité law passed in the French region of Quebec, which kind of carries into that French-speaking area some of the errors that we've already seen in France. So it suddenly tried to impose a laïcité and to ban people from wearing face coverings, to ban people from wearing religious symbols at work. And the national politicians have condemned the regional law, and the national courts, through the federal courts, have questioned the legality of some of those attempts to change the law in the Canadian context. But Quebec, being really strongly Roman Catholic in culture, very, very undiverse, has really pursued those laws. And of course, that then sends a signal into the country as well, where so many people are concentrated in one place. Most people don't get to meet a Muslim. And so then across in Toronto, we get this big increase in attacks, significantly because of the behavior of Trump and the behavior of the French parts of the country. And so you get a gentle pulling away at some of the things that have made Canada great. I mean, there was also an act that was passed in 2017, the Barbaric Practices Act. Mm-hmm. And it did address some difficult issues like honor killings, like forced marriages. But you could have actually renamed that act the Let's Make a List of Things We Don't Like About Muslims Act and then pass it. So it seems to me that Canada, in entering this space, isn't learning from best practice across the world. And particularly its French-speaking parts have borrowed the worst practice from across the world and imported it into the North American situation.
Which, of course, is a very sad state of affairs. Now, very interestingly, there are attempts by various groups to push back against this. I was just seeing about a group called Islam in Motion that is touring across Canada. Their full title is Islam in Motion, I'm a Muslim, ask me anything. They're going on the road to try and explain to people what Islam is and who Muslims are. Is this sort of educational foray the thing that's needed to open people's minds?
Well, I think we need a number of steps, and in Britain, for example, we skipped some of those steps. So we got a lot of things wrong before we started getting them right again. So the first thing is we need to gather good information on what's happening. And so there's a brilliant survey done last year by the Islamic Social Services Association in Canada showing that 52% of Canadians think that Muslims can't be trusted, and that 56% of them wouldn't like somebody from a Muslim family to marry their daughter. And when you find out perception, things like that in the wider community, you can then plan a response. So, for example, you can have bring a Muslim friend home from school day, bring a Muslim friend to your church on a Saturday day, so that people can begin to develop those relationships and wear away at some of those instinctive prejudices. And so you can plan educational campaigns like the one you've mentioned, and there have been great examples of women who cover from the University of Toronto doing art exhibitions and writing poetry and going on the media. But you can only plan that if you're tracking what's happening in government. So you know, for example, that the charity regulator is failing a Muslim charity, so that you know that Muslims aren't getting jobs in the health sector, so that you know the security service is focusing too much on Muslims. And then you can plan a public policy response. And then in civil society, well, a trip from Toronto to Quebec is like taking two worlds to meet each other in the same country. And those sorts of initiatives that you're talking about are critical. And I was very pleased to see actually the other day that the Ontario government, in recognition of some of the concerns that the Muslim community has been raising, so that's the government that covers most of the Muslim community here in Toronto, has allocated $300,000. And some of that is to help new arrivals that struggle with English to adapt to life in Canada with its freezing weather and its strange version of English. But most of it is to fund educational projects, just like the one you've mentioned, to build bridges. Now that's the Ontario government drawing on best international practice, in contrast to the Quebec government drawing on worst international practice. So there's going to be a challenge here to get the balance across the federal system, and maybe a stronger role for the central courts and the central parliament to make sure this doesn't go horribly wrong in one place while they're getting it right in another.
And of course, a lot of this does come from the the governmental level down, doesn't it? Whilst Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said there's no place for Islamophobia in Canada, with the elections coming up, they're kind of sidelining the discussion a little bit. Do they need to, at a governmental level, have more honest and more transparent conversations and look at legislation that backs them up?
Yeah, because I think if you're going to have a coherent strategy against Islamophobia, you need that regulation of the public services to make sure they're transparent. You need proper funding programs for those community-based schemes you're talking about. And then you need brave politicians like Mr. Trudeau not to be against Islamophobia every time something happens in Quebec, but to challenge it throughout the period of his time in office and in campaigns, including in the general election period. And that's really important in Canada. It's a massive country, second largest country in the world. And so if you go to Saskatchewan or to Nova Scotia and you campaign and you mobilize the threat of Islam, that's quite good politics out in those communities, because they're white, they may never have met maybe more than one Muslim, and the level of threat that they encounter is from all of the global news and the global media heading their way, and they don't see the other side of it. I mean, when the Quebec bombing happened, I think it merited 5 minutes coverage on the national news, and that was about it. So if you're out in Nova Scotia and Saskatchewan, you might not ever have heard about the bad things. You've only heard about the threat. And so an irresponsible politician wants to push at that button to get the vote out, and that needs to be really blocked. And so Trudeau needs to be consistent, so does everybody, and they need to say the same thing when they're running for the regional level as they do for the national level. because you can't be Islamophobic in most parts of Toronto, but then if you're in the national pitch, if you then come up with a different line, that's disgraceful.
Yeah, and the honesty, transparency, consistency, these are all things that we need to see to take us forward into the future. Professor Francis Davis, thank you so much for joining us today here on The Edge and giving us a very detailed explanation. The problem of Islamophobia can only be solved through dialogue in order to clear the false assumptions which are the main cause for Islamophobia. So our analysts have provided their insights on today's top stories. Let's have a roundup of what they had to say. Now, before closing our programme, let's take a look at social media to hear your voices and reactions on today's top story shared with the hashtag Ethiopia. And here's what you've been having to say today about Ethiopia on Twitter. Nesfine Zefru says the international community should denounce the TPLF for the massacre of 107 children in Afar. And Habat says USA has lost all its credibility in Africa because of its intervention scheme using the US press, humanitarian agencies and EU Parliament in its policy to pressure Ethiopia in the Tigray conflict. And Ioba says, repeating the word won't make it true. Genocide is what the TPLF has been committing on different Ethiopian ethnic groups for 30 years. Let's now take a look at our video of the day, which shows that wars did not stop even during the COVID-19 pandemic, forcing millions of people to flee their homes. And that's all for this episode of The Edge with me, Andy Boyns. Stay tuned. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth analysis on the top stories and a look beyond the edge.